Arcade Exclusives.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Arcade Exclusives, where we look at some of the games that never left the arcades. Today we're looking at 4 games from Psikyo, a Japanese developer founded in 1992. They're most known for their arcade shooters, many of which received home console ports. For example, Gunbird, Sengoku Blade, Strikers 1945, Cannon Spike, and my favourite Dreamcast game, Zero Gunner 2. A lot of these came to the Saturn and Dreamcast, the PlayStation and PS2, and several to modern consoles like the Switch in recent years. But a few of Psikyo's games were never ported to home consoles, remaining arcade-only games. Let's have a look at some of them. Zero Gunner was released for Sega's Model 2 hardware in 1997. For comparison, The House of the Dead was released for the Model 2 that same year. It's a vertical shooter, sort of, it's a grey area. That's because you can rotate your chopper 360 degrees, ladies, and also the screen sometimes scrolls horizontally, but in terms of the perspective, it's for all intents and purposes a vertical shooter. Zero Gunner always lived in the shadow of its 2001 sequel Zero Gunner 2, which, as I mentioned, is my favourite Dreamcast game. It would have been an easier job porting it, as it was released for Sega's Naomi arcade hardware, which was almost identical to the Dreamcast. Zero Gunner plays much the same, but Zero Gunner 2 made some design changes which greatly improved the gameplay. In this game you can lock onto enemies, which allows you to rotate around an enemy. There's a meter to show you how long you can lock on for, but as this meter is per enemy, you'll rarely deplete it fully. The lock on is actually more of an annoyance, so it's far better to just position your helicopter manually, especially when there are a lot of enemies on screen. In Zero Gunner 2 they scrapped this altogether, with you rotating your chopper manually. The controls are fiddly at first, but once you get used to it, it works brilliantly. In Zero Gunner you can play 2-player co-op, and there are 3 attack helicopters available to use. Enemies come at you from land, sea and air. You have a main shot which can be upgraded by collecting these P power-ups, and you also have a smart bomb attack which sends out a fiery shockwave from your chopper, and these can be obtained by collecting these B icons. The game has 4 difficulty settings, well, more like routes. There are 3 main routes, Asia, Europe and USA, each having 5 stages. Then there's expert difficulty, which is comprised of 10 random stages from the other 3. Expert mode is the only option that actually monitors your score, so this is the one to play. The stages are relatively short, building up to an epic boss fight. This is another area that Zero Gunner 2 took to the next level. Both games have some great looking bosses, but the sequel ramps it up in several ways. The first being that the bosses are even more showy and elaborate, but it also splits the fights into 2 stages, one where you fight a vehicle, then a second fight when the vehicle transforms into a mech. The sequel also hypes you up for the boss fights by switching to a brief cutscene and by playing some epic boss music, whereas in Zero Gunner the stage's music doesn't change during these fights, and the game's music in general is uninspiring. Although it's not as pretty as Zero Gunner 2, Zero Gunner does look superb for 1997 with its pseudo 3D visuals and huge bosses. If you want to play the series, you should without a doubt play the sequel, which is just an absolute treat, and as I said, did away with some of the less practical aspects of the original. Still, it would have been nice to have the original Zero Gunner on one of the recent Switch compilations, seeing as it's never left the arcade. Space Bomber is a single-screen shooter released in 1998. The gameplay consists of short single-screen stages played 1 or 2 player. This is so weird, but in that lovable Japanese shoot-'em-up way of being weird. What's that you say? A talking flying bin? Sure. Oh, and the bin is also a transformer? Of course it is, mate. The enemies are very quirky indeed, and there's all sorts going on here. Severed animal heads, turtle shells, strange faces, alien ships, and some larger than life bosses. Each screen is set somewhere different, usually a scene depicting a landmark from around the world as well as alien motherships and in space. Another amusing detail is the president, who pops up between stages with his mouth permanently open for some reason to egg you on. There's no story introduced at the start, but from the screens we can deduce that aliens have invaded Earth. As well as firing vertically, your little ship can use a grabber to capture enemies. These captured enemies sit behind your ship, and you can collect up to 3 at one time. Then you can use them by holding down fire, and different enemy types will do different things, for example acting as a shield or like a familiar to provide extra firepower. If you don't want to utilise them in this manner, there's also the option to fire them out as a bomb. There are also power-ups to collect to increase your main shot's power. The graphics wouldn't be as good if the game wasn't so absurd, but it's so mental that it ends up looking brilliant. The music is very cutesy, but the sound effects are crazy and non-stop, which makes the gameplay even more hectic. Space Bomber is a pretty fun shooter, especially if you have a soft spot for this quirky Japanese style. Although Psikyo are known for their shoot 'em ups, they make other games too. One early example is 1994's Battle K-Road. This is a versus fighter, but unlike its contemporaries, it plays more like a mixed martial arts game rather than featuring characters with super strength or fireballs shooting out of their hands and feet. There are 14 playable characters, split into groups of 2 from each of the following fighting disciplines: karate, boxing, Muay Thai, Commando Sambo, Sumo, Jiu-Jitsu and MMA. The 2 MMA fighters are both cyborgs for no well explained reason. The characters are all pretty much just palette swaps, so the 2 characters of each fighting style play exactly the same. They do have different heads, as you can see here with the 2 boxers Jeff and Rick. The reason there are 2 of each is that you must first face off against an opponent of your own discipline before taking on the other fighters in a tournament. That means that the seemingly impressive roster of 14 characters is in reality a selection of 7. The final opponent is a bear, hilariously called Mr. Bear, who exhibits some familiar moves such as a Shoryuken. As the combat features more traditional fighting, the controls are fairly simple, with 3 buttons for kicks and 3 for punches of various strengths. One really interesting aspect of the gameplay in Battle K-Road is the knockdowns. Whenever a character is knocked to the ground, this text pops up on screen and the match resets, with characters returning to their original positions. To be fair, this is how it works in a lot of professional fights like boxing, but here it only serves to break up the flow of the gameplay, and the flow of a fighting game can be one of its most important aspects, so this isn't a welcome inclusion. Still, as I say, interesting. The different fighters do move and fight like they're supposed to as well, with each fighter showing a distinct style relative to his or her respective discipline. But the lack of any special moves makes it get dull very quickly. Even for 1994, the graphics don't exactly excite, and the music is mostly decent enough, albeit forgettable. Battle K-Road is definitely an interesting paving stone on Psikyo's roadmap, but it's really nothing more than a curio. If you've ever wondered what Toy Story would look like as a side-scrolling shooter, then Pilot Kids could well be the answer. Released in 1999 for Sega's Model 2, much like Zero Gunner, and was the last official game for the hardware. It plays like a 2D horizontal shooter but has 3D characters and backgrounds, and plays very much like the so-called cute-em-ups like Fantasy Zone and Parodius. Played solo or in 2-player co-op, in Pilot Kids you control one of 2 siblings, Jeff and Emma, in a toy plane. Yes, they've inexplicably been shrunk down as well. It's the crossover you've all been waiting for, Toy Story meets Honey I Shrunk the Kids. The 7 stages take you through several rooms in the house, taking on the household's toys that have come to life. Rather than coming to life via some kind of inherent sentience as in Toy Story, in Pilot Kids it's an alien that's behind it all. Throughout the game you'll pilot the toy plane through several areas including the kids' bedrooms, bathroom, the garden and up into the loft. Most areas have enemies specific to that environment, For example, the garden stage has gnomes and wasps, and even the family dog chases you at one point. Eventually, after blasting your way through waves of animated toys, you must destroy this alien in a miniature flying saucer. The bosses are really fun takes on popular toys. My favourite is this Viking in a barrel, which is clearly an homage to Pop-Up Pirate, and he even fires the swords at you. The weapon system is quite unique. You have 2 shots in your arsenal, a regular shot and homing missiles. The regular shot is very weak, so it takes a good burst of fire to destroy even smaller enemies. The homing missiles are the weapon you'll want to be using for the most part. You first lock onto enemies and then fire the missiles, which destroy any tagged enemies as well as any unlucky enough to get in the path of your missile. The missiles can be upgraded with power-ups, allowing you to lock onto up to 6 enemies. The more enemies you target, the more your score multiplier increases, up to 64 times, so chaining these missile attacks is the key to scoring big. Enemies fire either orange or blue shots, with the blue shots being particularly deadly. The orange shots can be shot down using your plane's regular shot, and this is pretty much all that weapon is good for. The graphics, music and the whole concept just oozes fun. Much like Space Bomber, Pilot Kids is a quirky little shooter, and it manages to stand out among the other cute-em-ups. So that was 4 of Psikyo's arcade-only games. Have you played any of these? Let me know in the comments, and as always, thanks for watching. You can find the rest of the arcade exclusive series in this playlist.